They say that on a snowy morning in Cambridge, history at Harvard stopped. Not because of a professor, not because of a great discovery, but because of the trembling voice of a 5-year-old boy, the son of a janitor. Sanders Theater was crowded that morning. The curved wooden ceiling arched like the inside of a cathedral, and the yellow lamps poured their light onto rows of worn wooden benches. Outside, the first snow of the season was drifting quietly across the Charles River, covering the marble steps in white. Inside, Professor Harold Ellison, a man known for his work on dynamical systems, was drawing loops on the blackboard. The chalk struck in measured taps, leaving behind a chain of symbols. xn plus 1 equals f of xn. This, he said, is the heart of repetition in mathematics. From a single beginning, x0, we apply the same function again and again, like an echo across a canyon, like footsteps in a hallway that never ends. The question we still cannot answer is this: does the loop ever return? Does it ever come home? The hall was quiet. The students of Harvard, sharp-minded and certain of their future, listened closely. They knew this was one of the unsolved mysteries. Under what conditions does a sequence of repeated steps settle, and under what conditions does it drift away forever? At the back of the room, near the door, sat a small boy. His coat was too big, the sleeves falling past his hands. It smelled faintly of cheap laundry soap. His mother, Grace Wells, had worked a night shift cleaning classrooms in the math building and had not yet gone home to rest. She had let her son wait inside the warm lecture hall instead of the cold outside. His name was Rowan Wells. He did not understand all the long strings of symbols, but his eyes fixed on the chalk loops with quiet intensity. They reminded him of the sound of trains at night. They reminded him of the endless cycle of moving with his mother from one cleaning job to another, always starting again, never settling. Professor Ellison paused. He turned back to the room, his voice low and firm. And why the loop does not return home, that is the mystery which generations have failed to solve. A small sound broke the silence. Rowan had lifted his hand. His tiny fingers shook as they reached into the air. The room froze. Students glanced around, surprised. Who had let a child inside this lecture? Ellison narrowed his eyes, half annoyed, half curious. Yes? What is it, young man? Rowan swallowed hard. His voice trembled, but it carried clearly. Excuse me, but why does the loop never go home? Silence. A silence so deep that the old beams of the ceiling seemed to lean closer. In the front row, a graduate student let out a small laugh. But the laugh died quickly, because Professor Ellison did not move. His chalk hung in midair. His face was pale. The boy had asked the one question that touched the nerve of the entire subject. In mathematics, they called it the problem of convergence. When you repeat a function again and again, sometimes the sequence runs away to infinity, and sometimes it settles down to a single point. But in many cases, the outcome is unknown, unpredictable. The loop may wander forever, never finding its center. Ellison had spent his career trying to find the rules that determined when a loop would come home. Now, a 5-year-old boy had spoken those words aloud, without calculation, without pretense. He stammered, That is a very difficult question." Rowan looked at the blackboard. His voice was quiet, but every student heard it. "Maybe the loop forgets where home is." Grace gasped. She wanted to pull her son away immediately. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew the cruelty of crowds, the way educated voices could cut down a poor child. She had lived too long in the shadows, working with her head bent low. She feared the lights of that hall would burn her son. But Ellison raised his hand, stopping her. His eyes locked on Rowan as if he had glimpsed a thin crack of light in a stone wall. "A loop that forgets," he whispered. "Recursion as memory, not only repetition." The students stirred. Some smiled in amusement, dismissing it as childish. But others felt a shiver. There was a strange weight in those words, a poetic truth hidden in them. Rowan lowered his gaze. He clutched the small notebook he carried everywhere. Inside were pages filled with pencil spirals, round and round, never closing, like the endless jobs his mother took, house after house, shift after shift. The lecture ended in a haze. There was no burst of applause, only a heavy silence. Ellison stood at the blackboard, the chalk trembling in his hand. He wanted to finish the proof, but his hand would not move. At last he set the chalk down. On the board remained an unfinished spiral, broken off mid-turn. He turned away, unable to erase it. Grace hurried her son through the wooden doors, whispering harshly, "Rowan, you must not draw attention. They do not understand. They will laugh at you." But the boy looked back at the hall, where the lights glowed like a church in the dusk. He did not know why he had asked the question. He only knew there was a deep ache in his chest. If the loop never found its way home, then would he and his mother ever find a home of their own? That night, snow thickened across Cambridge. In their small, rented room, Grace tucked Rowan into bed. The heater rattled weakly. Rowan pulled out his notebook and drew another spiral. At its center, he wrote one small word: home. Across the city, Professor Ellison sat alone in his office. The blackboard before him still held the equation, xn plus 1 equals f of xn. But now, beside it, he had written another line. It was the first time in 30 years of teaching that he had written something he dared not erase. What if the loop forgets? Outside, the snow fell without sound. Inside, a single question had shifted the weight of history. It was the morning after the snow. Cambridge streets were still white, though wagons and boots had pressed dark lines through the drifts. The campus chimed with bells, and students hurried between brick buildings wrapped in scarves. Inside Harvard's mathematics building, the air smelled of chalk dust and radiator heat. Professor Harold Ellison sat at his desk in Office 314, a small room with tall windows and a blackboard that covered nearly an entire wall. He had not slept. The words still echoed. Maybe the loop forgets where home is. For 30 years, Ellison had worked on recursion and convergence. His notebooks were filled with symbols, definitions, lemmas, but never had he thought of memory. He had always treated loops as cold machines, numbers pushed forward, rules applied, results measured. Forgetfulness was not in the language of mathematics. Yet now he could not stop seeing it, like a crack in the wall widening each hour. That morning there was a knock. When he opened the door, he saw Grace Wells, tired from another shift. She held her son by the shoulder. Rowan's hair was messy, his boots too big for his feet. "Professor," Grace said softly, "I am sorry about yesterday. Rowan should not have spoken in your class. Please forgive him." Ellison shook his head. "No, Mrs. Wells, do not apologize. If you would allow it, I would like to speak with him." Grace hesitated. She had learned long ago that attention could be dangerous. The world of scholars and professors was not built for people like her. But there was no mockery in Ellison's eyes, only a kind of unsettled wonder. Slowly, she nodded and left her son with him. Office 314 was quiet, except for the hiss of the radiator. "Rowan," Ellison said gently, "yesterday you asked why the loop never goes home. Can you show me how you see it?" Rowan looked shy, almost afraid. But then he pulled from his coat pocket the little notebook he always carried. He climbed onto a chair, opened a page, and laid it on the desk. The page was filled with spirals, some tight, some loose, some broken. None of them closed. Ellison leaned closer. Rowan tapped the drawings with his finger. They keep turning, but when they forget, they leave space for the next one. Like when I forget a dream. The next night there is room for another dream. Ellison felt a strange heat in his chest. He had always described recursion as iteration, but iteration was a machine word. Memory was a human word. Could it be that mathematics was not only a machine but also a story of remembering and forgetting? He stood, walked to the blackboard, and wrote with chalk. Recursion is memory, not just repetition. He stared at the sentence. His hand trembled. Then he underlined it once. For the first time in decades, he wrote a line on the blackboard that he did not want to erase. Rowan wandered to the blackboard too. He was small enough that he had to stretch on his toes. With Ellison's chalk, he drew another spiral. But this one was different. Each loop was not placed on top of the last. Instead, each new loop shifted slightly outward, as if the memory of the past loop guided its step. "See?" Rowan said. "If it remembers, it stays in the same place. If it forgets, it moves. But both are still loops." Ellison's throat tightened. He whispered, "Yes. Yes." He realized the child was not solving equations. He was offering metaphors. Yet sometimes metaphors reached where formulas could not. The hours slipped by. Grace returned to the door, surprised to see her son and the professor still at the board together. She had expected scolding. Instead, she saw Rowan's cheeks glowing, chalk on his hands. "Rowan," she said firmly, "it is time to go." Ellison turned to her. His voice was softer than she had ever heard. "Mrs. Wells, if you allow me, I would like Rowan to come here sometimes, not for answers. Only for the way he sees." Grace shook her head. "He is just a child, and we have work. I do not want him to be hurt by hopes that do not belong to us." But Ellison said quietly, "Sometimes the future arrives in a form no one expects, even a child." Grace looked down at Rowan. His small hand was still smudged with chalk dust. She had never seen him so alive. At last, she sighed. "Only sometimes. Only if it does not interfere with school." Rowan smiled faintly, though he did not yet understand how unusual this moment was. That night, Ellison sat alone again in Office 314. The spiral Rowan had drawn still shone on the board. He stared at it long into the evening. The chalk seemed less like a line of numbers now and more like a living thing, circling, forgetting, remembering, moving. He wrote in his notebook, "A loop is not only function, it is memory. To forget is to make space. To remember is to stay." He knew his colleagues would laugh at such words. They wanted proofs, theorems, clean results. They had no patience for the language of children. Yet inside him, something had shifted. He could not return to the old way of seeing. A week passed. Each morning, Rowan came to Office 314 before school. He would sit at the desk, drawing spirals, while Ellison worked nearby. Sometimes they did not speak. Sometimes Ellison asked questions. "Rowan, what happens if the spiral turns inward forever?" Rowan answered. "Then it falls asleep. And if it turns outward without end? Then it gets lost. And what if it turns but also breathes?" Rowan thought long, then whispered, "Then it lives." Ellison wrote these words down. He could not explain them with symbols, but he felt they contained a truth mathematics had not yet dared to name. One afternoon, a graduate student knocked and entered, surprised to see the child inside. He frowned. "Professor, may I ask, what is this boy doing here?" Ellison hesitated. He sensed the risk. He knew Harvard faculty did not look kindly on distractions, especially those that looked like sentimentality. "He is only showing me how he sees loops," Ellison said. The student smirked. "With crayons?" Rowan looked down, ashamed. Grace's warning echoed in his heart. But Ellison stepped forward, voice firm. "With a vision that you and I may never find, even after a lifetime of symbols." The student was stunned. He left without another word. After the door closed, Ellison turned to Rowan. "Do not be afraid. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the farthest." Rowan nodded, though he did not fully believe it. That evening, as the winter sky grew dark, Grace came to fetch her son. She saw Ellison staring at the board, still marked with spirals. "Professor," she said softly, "you seem changed." Ellison gave a weary smile. "I am. Your son has given me a question I cannot escape." Grace looked at Rowan, then back at the professor. She did not know whether to feel fear or hope. Life had taught her that great institutions took much and gave little. But as she watched Rowan's eyes shine in the fading light, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine that perhaps her child's gift might not be swallowed by silence. The whisper of the boy's question did not stay inside Office 314. At Harvard, even silence has a way of spreading. Students spoke in corridors. A rumor began. The professor had been shaken by a child. Within a week, the dean of mathematics, Richard Marshall, sent a message to Professor Ellison. "Closed meeting. Faculty only. Urgent matter." That Thursday afternoon, in a room lined with oil portraits of solemn scholars, the senior faculty of the mathematics department gathered. The heavy oak table stretched long, polished to a cold shine. Outside, the snow was melting, dripping against the old glass windows. Professor Ellison sat near the end, his notes clutched in his hands. Across from him, men and women who had spent their lives on equations, each carrying the weight of long careers. Giants, in every sense of the word. The dean began without ceremony. "We are here," Marshall said, "because of an incident. A lecture was interrupted. A child," he glanced at Ellison, "posed a question that has since unsettled the department. We must decide how to handle this." Some faculty chuckled. Professor Adler, known for his sharp tongue, leaned back. "A child? We are wasting our time." Another, Professor Lane, adjusted his spectacles. "But the reports are curious. The boy spoke of loops and memory. Ellison, what exactly happened?" Ellison cleared his throat. He felt the eyes pressing on him. He described the scene, the raised hand, the trembling question, the spiral in chalk. He repeated Rowan's words. "Maybe the loop forgets where home is." A ripple passed through the room. Some laughed outright. Others frowned, considering. Adler scoffed. "We are mathematicians, not poets. This is sentimental nonsense. A loop does not remember, and it does not forget. It obeys rules, nothing more." But Professor Lane murmured, "Still, the metaphor has power. We often describe systems as if they were alive. Why should this be so different?" Dean Marshall raised his hand for silence. His voice was calm, but heavy. "Colleagues, we must be careful. Harvard is not a playground. If we allow a 5-year-old child to influence our lectures, our reputation suffers. Yet," he paused, glancing at Ellison, I also know that sometimes new vision comes from unexpected places. The question before us is this: do we treat this as an embarrassment to be erased or as a moment to be examined? The room grew tense. Adler snapped. It is dangerous. Today it is a child. Tomorrow the newspapers. We will look ridiculous. Lane countered softly. Or tomorrow it may be an insight we did not dare to see. Ellison's voice broke the stalemate. Colleagues, I do not claim the boy solved a theorem, but I confess I have not been able to erase his words from my mind. Recursion as memory. A loop that forgets. Perhaps it is nothing. Or perhaps it is the seed of a new way to ask the question we have failed to answer for decades. I cannot ignore it. The room fell quiet again. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Dean Marshall leaned forward. You are a respected scholar, Harold. If you believe there is something here, you may pursue it, but... His voice sharpened. You must do so discreetly. No announcements. No indulgence in childish fancies. If word of this becomes spectacle, it will not be tolerated. Ellison bowed his head. I understand. The meeting adjourned. Professors filed out, coats brushing against the chairs, whispers trailing. Some dismissed the whole affair as foolishness. Others, though they would not admit it aloud, felt a small stirring. When the room was nearly empty, Dean Marshall lingered. He placed a hand on Ellison's shoulder. Harold, he said quietly, I envy you. It has been years since I felt shaken by a question. Ellison looked at him with weary eyes. It is not my question, Richard. It belongs to a child. The dean gave a thin smile. Then perhaps it is time we remember how to listen to children. That evening, Ellison returned to Office 314. Rowan was waiting with Grace, his little notebook open on the desk. Ellison sat across from him. Rowan, today the faculty met about you. Rowan's eyes widened. Did I do something wrong? Ellison shook his head. No, my boy. You only asked a question. And sometimes a question is more dangerous than an answer. Grace stiffened. Dangerous? We do not want trouble. Ellison looked at her gently. I know. But understand this. Your son has touched something none of us have touched. The giants of mathematics debated today whether a child's metaphor could open a locked door. Rowan did not understand all the words, but he understood the weight in the professor's voice. He whispered, Did they laugh? Ellison hesitated, then told the truth. Some did, but others listened. For days after, Ellison noticed a change in his colleagues. Some avoided him, as though his involvement with the boy were a mark of weakness. Others lingered longer in the corridors, curious to see the child's spirals. No one admitted it openly, but the question was alive in them too. Rowan himself remained quiet. He did not boast, did not seek attention. He simply drew, morning after morning, as though the spirals were prayers. One morning, Ellison entered the office to find Rowan asleep at the desk, his head resting on the notebook. The page beneath him showed a spiral that suddenly broke off, then began again a little farther away. Ellison touched the page softly. A loop that forgets, and so begins anew. He thought of the meeting, of the great men and women around the oak table, trapped by their own loops of pride and caution. Perhaps it took forgetting their certainties, for something new to begin. It began, as such things often do, with a single line. One sheet of notes, carelessly left on a desk after the meeting, carried Rowan's words in Ellison's handwriting. What if the loop forgets? A graduate student found it, puzzled, then amused. He snapped a photograph with his phone. By evening, it had appeared on a small blog dedicated to strange notes from Harvard. By midnight, it had been copied to larger forums. By dawn, the phrase had traveled farther than the snow melting along the Charles River. On the internet, the boy did not remain nameless for long. Someone remembered the child in Sanders Theater. Another recalled seeing him with Grace, the janitor. Within days, headlines appeared. The Loop Boy of Harvard. 5-year-old stuns professor with single question. Genius or folly? The child who asked where loops go. At first, the stories were playful. Reporters wrote of a prodigy who had baffled professors with a riddle. The image of a small child against the backdrop of Harvard's great halls made for irresistible copy. But soon, the tone shifted. Some praised him as a symbol of innocence breaking the pride of scholars. Others mocked, saying it was nothing but childish fancy. Grace read the articles with trembling hands. Her heart sank with each headline. She had never wanted the spotlight. Their life depended on invisibility, quiet jobs, quiet rooms, no attention. Attention was dangerous. Attention could take her child away. "Rowan," she whispered, clutching him close. "We must be careful. The story is growing faster than we can hide." At Harvard, the storm swept through the faculty. Some professors grew defensive. "This is exactly why we must guard our lectures," Adler barked. "A circus has begun. Mathematics turned into gossip." Others, though they said little, felt a thrill. For the first time in years, ordinary people were speaking about recursion, about convergence, about mathematics itself. The boy had turned a dry subject into a living conversation. Ellison felt torn between pride and dread. He knew Grace's fear was real, yet he also knew the echo could not be stopped. Once a question had escaped into the world, it could not be silenced. One night, as snow blew against the windows, Rowan sat with his mother in their small room. He was drawing quietly, his pencil scratching spirals across the paper. Grace folded a newspaper, her face pale. "Rowan," she said softly, "they are writing about you. Some say good things, some say cruel things. But listen to me. None of them know you. They only know the story. The story is swallowing you." Rowan looked up. His eyes were calm, almost too calm for a child. "Mama, if the story is big, maybe it has room for us. Maybe we can fit inside." Grace shook her head fiercely. "No. We do not fit in their world. Their world will use you and throw you away." Rowan touched her hand. "Then I will make another world, a smaller one, where loops can rest." Her heart ached. How could a 5-year-old speak with such quiet certainty? She pulled him close, as if her arms could shield him from words printed on paper and screens glowing in the night. Meanwhile, in Office 314, students began arriving uninvited. They came early, sitting in silence as Rowan drew spirals. Some said it felt like a chapel. The boy rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. "If a loop forgets," he said once, writing it in chalk, "the next one remains." The students copied the phrase into notebooks. They debated it over coffee. To them, it was not a theorem, but a kind of prayer. Ellison watched, uneasy yet moved. He felt the paradox. A child too young to know the dangers of fame, yet already creating a sanctuary for restless minds. But storms do not spare sanctuaries. A journalist learned of room 314 and demanded access. When denied, he waited in the hallway, hoping for a glimpse. A blurry photo of Rowan leaving with his mother appeared online. "The Loop Boy walks among us." Soon strangers arrived on campus, hoping to see the child. Some carried notebooks, others only curiosity. Grace's fear deepened each day. One evening, she confronted Ellison in the office. Her voice trembled with anger. You do not understand. I have raised Rowan in shadows so he could be safe, and now, because of you, he is everywhere. He is on their lips, in their papers. He is no longer mine." Ellison bowed his head. "Grace, I never wished this. But the question has left him. It belongs to the world now." Tears filled her eyes. "But he is only a boy. How can the world belong to him?" That night, Rowan lay awake, listening to the wind. He whispered to himself, as though to the spiral he had drawn that morning, "If the world forgets me, maybe that will leave space for the next child." He did not know that outside, the echo was growing louder with every passing day. The storm outside grew louder each day. Headlines rose and fell. Strangers whispered in the halls. But inside the old mathematics building, there was a room that seemed untouched by it all. Room 2.14. It was not a grand lecture hall like Sanders Theater. It was a modest classroom with high windows, wooden floors, and a blackboard worn smooth by decades of chalk. It smelled of dust and heat from tired radiators. Yet slowly, almost without anyone deciding it, Room 2.14 became something more than a classroom. It became a sanctuary. It began with Rowan. Each morning, long before classes started, he asked his mother to let him wait there. Grace would finish her shift cleaning nearby offices and peek in to see him sitting at the front desk, notebook open, pencil in hand. At first, he drew alone. Spirals. Always spirals. Some so faint they seemed to vanish, some bold and dark, filling the page. But one morning, a graduate student named Clara stopped by. She had heard the rumors but had not believed them. She expected noise or spectacle. Instead, she found silence and a small boy drawing with steady patience. She sat in the back, waiting, listening. Rowan never greeted her. He simply drew, then paused, then whispered to himself, "If a loop forgets, the next one remains." Clara wrote the words in her notebook. The next day, she returned, and this time she was not alone. A friend came, then another. Soon a handful of students began slipping into room 214 each morning. They came not for answers, but for the quiet way questions were born. It felt, some said later, like entering a chapel. There were no sermons, no demands, only chalk, silence, and the slow drawing of spirals. Ellison, watching from the doorway one morning, felt something stir deep within him. He had taught in great halls to hundreds of students, but never had he seen such listening. Here, a boy too young for school was teaching not by words, but by presence. One morning, Rowan rose on tiptoe and wrote on the blackboard in shaky letters, "If a loop forgets, the next one remains." He stepped back. His small hand left a smear of chalk dust on his sleeve. He said nothing more. The students sat in stillness, as though the words themselves were a proof. Some later admitted they could not explain why they copied the phrase, yet they felt it held weight, like a law written in the bones of the world. Grace was puzzled by what she saw. She feared attention, feared crowds. Yet in room 214 there was no shouting, no cameras, only quiet devotion. She stood at the door one morning, mop still in hand, and whispered to Ellison, "Why do they come?" Ellison answered softly, "Because they are learning something they cannot find in any textbook. They are learning how to listen." Grace looked at Rowan, so small among the tall students. Her heart trembled. She wanted to protect him, but she also felt the warmth in the room. It was not the cold spotlight of the world outside. It was something gentler, like a fire on a winter night. The sanctuary grew. By the end of the week, 20 students arrived at dawn. They brought notebooks, not for calculations, but to record the boy's metaphors. One wrote, "The spiral is a memory that bends." Another, "A loop that rests becomes a circle." Soon, even professors slipped quietly into the back, unwilling to admit they had come, yet unwilling to stay away. They sat in silence with their students, listening to a 5-year-old trace lines of chalk. One morning, Rowan turned to the group and asked, "If you forget something, does it mean it is gone, or does it mean it is waiting?" No one answered, not because they did not know, but because the question itself felt like enough. Clara whispered later to a friend, "This child has turned forgetting into a gift." In those weeks, Room 214 became a hidden world. Outside, journalists argued, critics mocked, admirers praised. But inside, the boys' spirals gathered like quiet prayers. Each line of chalk seemed to carry not just mathematics, but memory, longing, loss, and hope. For Grace, it was both comfort and fear. She saw her son cradled in warmth, yet she knew sanctuaries are fragile. They cannot remain untouched forever. One evening, Ellison stayed after the others had gone. He stared at the board, where Rowan's sentence still glowed faintly in chalk dust. "If a loop forgets, the next one remains." He whispered to himself, "This is not mathematics alone. This is the story of life." He thought of his own years, each lecture, each attempt at proof. How many times had he repeated the same steps, never reaching home? And now a child had reminded him, forgetting is not always loss. It can also be the space where something new begins. But even sanctuaries cannot escape the echo forever. Rumors of Room 214 began to spread. Students told friends. Friends told reporters. Soon the quiet room would be tested. For now, though, it held. Rowan continued to draw at dawn. Students arrived in silence, as if stepping onto sacred ground. Grace stood in the doorway, torn between fear and wonder. And Ellison, once a man of cold equations, found himself writing in his notebook words he had never allowed before. Some proofs are not solved by symbols. Some are solved by listening. Word of Room 214 could not remain hidden forever. By winter's end, the mathematics department scheduled a colloquium, a formal gathering of faculty and students. The intention, at least on paper, was simple: to restore order, to return the conversation to serious ground. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the truth. The department wanted to see the child. The notice was discreet, printed on a single sheet tacked to the hallway board. Special Colloquium, Friday, Sanders Annex. No name was given. Yet by the morning of the event, the room was filled to the edges. Professors in wool coats, graduate students with notebooks, even a handful of outsiders who had heard whispers. The air carried the tension of something unspoken, like a congregation waiting for a sermon it did not quite believe in. Rowan entered quietly, holding his mother's hand. Grace's eyes darted nervously. She would have turned and fled, but Ellison met them at the door. He spoke softly. "You do not have to prove anything. Only be yourself." Rowan nodded, though his small face was pale. He clutched his little notebook as if it were a shield. When the time came, he did not climb to the podium. He simply sat on the floor in front of the blackboard. The crowd shifted, surprised, uneasy. Some smiled in pity. Others frowned in disapproval. Rowan opened his notebook. With slow patience, he drew a spiral. He did not speak for a long while. The room grew restless. Papers rustled. A cough echoed. Still, the boy drew, each curve steady, each pause deliberate. Finally, in a voice soft but clear, he said, When you look at this, you think it repeats, but it does not. Each turn is new. It remembers a little. It forgets a little. That is how it grows. He set the chalk down. Then silence. 30 seconds passed. Long, unbearable seconds. Students glanced at professors. Professors glanced at the dean. Some began to frown, but others leaned forward, eyes fixed, as though afraid to break the moment. Something was happening in that silence, something words could not hold. A graduate student whispered to herself, "It is not a lecture. It is listening." Someone at the back, irritated, pulled out a phone and recorded the scene. A 30-second clip. A boy sitting cross-legged, chalk spiral behind him, speaking of remembering and forgetting. That night, the clip was shared online. By morning, thousands had seen it. By evening, millions. Reactions split like lightning. Some praised it as a revelation, a child reshaping the way we think about iteration and time. A new Einstein, one headline read. Others dismissed it as theater, a clever trick of metaphor dressed as mathematics. A leading journal published a sharp piece, Childish Metaphors and the Danger of Sentiment in Mathematics. The author mocked the silence, called it performance art. Yet inside Harvard, the silence lingered. Professors found themselves unsettled. Some returned secretly to room 214, unable to resist. Others wrote new notes, half ashamed, using words they had once dismissed. Memory, forgetting, breath. Grace, meanwhile, felt the weight of the storm pressing harder. She saw her son's face on news feeds, strangers debating his worth. One evening she turned to Ellison, voice trembling with fear. "They are using him. They call him genius one day, fraud the next. He is only a boy. He is not made for this." Ellison answered gently, "Perhaps not. But perhaps he is showing us that mathematics, too, is not made only for the strong. Perhaps it is also made for the fragile." Grace shook her head, torn between wanting to protect her son and realizing she could not stop what had begun. Rowan himself seemed strangely calm. He continued his routine, rising early, drawing spirals in 2.14, speaking in whispers that felt like prayers. He did not care about the words outside. To him, the silence inside the room was enough. One morning, Clara, the graduate student, asked him softly, "Rowan, do you know people are calling you a genius?" Rowan looked puzzled. "What is genius?" Clara searched for words. "It means someone who sees what others cannot." Rowan thought for a moment. Then he said, "But I do not see more. I only listen longer." The colloquium left its mark. Though critics dismissed it, though journals rejected it, something had changed. In offices and libraries, scholars found themselves pausing before equations. They stared at loops and thought not only of numbers, but of memory, of forgetting, of silence. For some, it was unsettling. For others, liberating. And in room 214, a quiet revolution continued, hidden from the noise outside. Students gathered each dawn, not to chase headlines, but to sit with a boy who drew spirals and spoke softly of loops that remembered and loops that forgot. Winter loosened its grip. Snow gave way to damp ground and the Charles River flowed free again. Yet the storm around Rowan did not melt so quickly. The video of the colloquium of silence continued to circle the world. Some universities mocked it. Others invited Rowan with a tone of half curiosity, half spectacle. Grace refused every letter, every call. She wanted her son far from stages, far from cameras. But one invitation arrived that Ellison himself carried in his hands. He entered room 214, where Rowan was drawing quietly, and laid the envelope on the desk. "The Institute for Advanced Study," he said softly. Princeton. They ask you to visit. Rowan looked up, puzzled. What is Princeton? Ellison smiled faintly. A place where the greatest minds in mathematics and physics gather. Einstein once walked its halls. It is a garden of ideas. Grace stiffened. No, she said at once. We are not parading him from one hall to another. He is not a show. Ellison bowed his head. I understand. But Grace, not all invitations are the same. Some doors, once opened, may change a life. Rowan touched the envelope with chalk-stained fingers. He whispered, Do gardens have loops? Ellison's eyes grew moist. Yes, Rowan. Some of the deepest loops live there. A month later, they arrived in Princeton, New Jersey. The Institute's grounds stretched quiet and green, far from city noise. Walking paths wound through fields and woods. Scholars wandered in silence, papers under their arms. It did not feel like Harvard's crowded halls. It felt almost like a monastery, a place where thought could breathe. They led Rowan and Grace to the fractal garden, a space designed with winding paths that split, curved, and rejoined, imitating the branching of trees, rivers, and veins. Here, a physicist named Dr. Ishan Patel knelt to meet Rowan's eyes. He was younger than Ellison, his face gentle but bright with curiosity. Rowan, Patel said, do you see how the paths divide, then meet again? We call this a fractal. It is like a loop that breathes. Rowan's eyes widened. He traced the paths with his finger, following curves that doubled back yet never fully closed. A loop that breathes, he whispered. Then maybe it can rest. Patel smiled. Yes, not all loops race forever. Some loops pause, inhale, exhale. For hours they walked the garden. Rowan asked small questions in his quiet voice. Does the loop remember the branch it left behind? Does it know it may return? The scholars listened, amused yet moved, writing his words down like fragile seeds. Grace watched with cautious eyes. She could not deny the peace of this place. It was not the noise of journalists. It was not the mockery of headlines. Here, at least, Rowan was not spectacle, but guest. That night, Ellison dined with Patel and other fellows. Their voices were low, thoughtful. There is something in this child, Patel said, that reaches beyond proof. He speaks as though mathematics were alive. Another replied, That is precisely what troubles me. Mathematics must remain sharp. If we let poetry into it, we risk confusion. Patel shook his head. Or perhaps we risk remembering what we forgot. The next morning, as Grace folded their few clothes, she found an envelope slipped under the door. The paper was thin, the letters typed, unsigned. Your son is not a wonder. He is a threat. Keep him silent, or others will silence him for you. Grace's hands trembled. She read it twice, then crumpled it in fear. Her mind raced with dark images, strangers in crowds, voices turned cruel, hands reaching for her child. When Rowan returned from the garden, she held him close, whispering prayers under her breath. That night, while he slept, she stepped outside to the garden's edge. She lit a match, set the letter aflame, and watched it curl into ash. The wind carried it into the branches. Her tears fell into the soil. Please, she whispered to the night, do not take him from me. Ellison noticed her fear. He sat with her under the quiet trees. Grace, he said, this letter, do not let it steal your peace. Envy runs deep in our world. Some fear change more than they fear ignorance. but they cannot erase what Rowan has already given us." She shook her head. "You do not understand. He is my only child. I have already lost so much. If they call him threat, what comes next?" Ellison was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke slowly. "Perhaps change is always lonely. Perhaps those who bring it must carry that weight. But you and Rowan do not carry it alone. Not anymore." Grace looked into his eyes and saw a sincerity that eased her heart, if only slightly. On their final day, Rowan asked to return to the fractal garden. He walked the winding paths, tracing spirals in the air with his finger. "Professor," he said to Ellison, "if a loop can breathe, then maybe it can fall asleep and wake again." Ellison nodded, voice hushed. "Yes, Rowan. That is what we call renewal." Rowan smiled faintly. "Then maybe forgetting is just sleeping." By the summer of that year, Rowan's name had traveled far beyond Cambridge and Princeton. Europe began to call. Invitations arrived from Paris, Oxford, Zurich. Most Grace tore apart before her son could see them, but one reached Ellison's hands first. A formal request from the International Congress of Mathematicians. It was to be held in Zurich, in the great auditorium known as the ear-shaped room, designed so that even the faintest whisper at one end could be heard at the other. "They want Rowan to speak," Ellison said softly to Grace. She froze. "He is 6 years old. He is not a speaker. He is a child." Ellison nodded. "I know. But Grace, sometimes history does not ask if we are ready. Sometimes it opens a door and waits only once." Grace turned to her son. Rowan was tracing spirals on the window glass with his finger, fogging it with his breath. "Zurich," he whispered, as though the word itself were another loop. The journey was long, filled with restless nights and the strange hum of airplanes. When they arrived, Zurich greeted them with bright summer skies, trams gliding on rails, and the Alps standing distant like ancient guardians. The Congress gathered more than 2,000 scholars from every corner of the world. The ear-shaped room, vast and luminous, curved like a listening shell. It was built for voices to travel, for echoes to return. Rowan stood at the entrance holding Grace's hand, dwarfed by the scale. His small frame looked fragile against the sea of dark suits and sharp eyes. Grace whispered urgently, "You do not have to do this. If you are afraid, we can leave." Rowan looked up at her calmly. "Mama, I am not afraid. The room is only another loop. I will breathe, and it will breathe back." When his turn came, the chairman introduced him not with pomp, but with uncertainty. "A special participant," he said, "whose question has stirred much discussion. Rowan Wells." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Some leaned forward, eager. Others leaned back, skeptical, even mocking. Rowan did not climb to the podium. Instead, he walked slowly to the blackboard at floor level. He picked up a piece of chalk, stood on his toes, and drew a single curve. A breath. Another curve. Another. The line folded back, looped, then returned to its beginning. Finally, he turned and spoke, his voice small but carried by the perfect acoustics. "A breath that returns to itself is still alive." Silence. He set the chalk down, sat cross-legged on the floor, and said nothing more. The room was divided. Some were furious. "Is this what we have come for? A child's riddle?" one whispered harshly. Others were entranced. A young mathematician from Italy wiped tears from her eyes. "Do you not see? He has given us a picture of convergence more human than any formula." A senior physicist muttered, "Revolution or theater? Which is it?" Arguments broke out in the hallways. Some called it the death of rigor. Others called it the birth of a new way of seeing. But amid the noise, the ear-shaped room held its own truth. Every word Rowan had spoken, every silence he had allowed, returned to the listeners as if carried on invisible waves. The room itself became part of the lesson. Listening was as important as speaking. That night, newspapers across Europe printed clashing headlines. Child prophet of Loops shocks Zurich. Mathematics or performance art? 6-year-old confuses scholars. The ear that heard a breath. Back in Cambridge, room 214 remained unchanged. A few students gathered at dawn, as they always had. Clara, the graduate student, wrote on the board, "Wait, listen first." Grace could not sleep in Zurich. She walked the quiet hotel corridor, heart pounding. When she returned to the room, she found Rowan sitting awake, staring at his notebook. "Why are you not resting, my love?" she asked softly. Rowan answered, "Because I am listening. The room is still speaking." She gathered him into her arms. "Rowan, they will argue about you forever. Some will praise, some will curse. But to me, you are only my boy. You do not need to carry the world." Rowan leaned into her shoulder. "Mama, I am not carrying it. I am only breathing it." Her tears fell silently into his hair. The Congress ended with no resolution. Committees filed reports, academics debated late into the night, but none could erase the image of the child on the floor, chalk spiral behind him, whispering of breath that returns. Some dismissed him. Some were haunted. All remembered. After Zurich, the noise only grew. Praise and fury crossed oceans. Invitations multiplied. Critics sharpened their pens. Admirers whispered his name as if it were prayer. But Rowan himself did not change. Back in Cambridge, he returned each dawn to room 214. Chalk dust on his hands, silence in his chest. Students still gathered in that hidden sanctuary, sitting in the hush as if listening to snowfall. For a time, it seemed the world outside could not breach those walls. Yet sanctuaries, no matter how sacred, are never safe forever. It began with paint. One morning in early autumn, Clara arrived first and found the door locked. When at last the custodian opened it, she froze. The blackboard was gone. The walls were newly painted white, erasing every mark, every spiral, every trace of what had been. Room 214 was no more. By noon, the students had gathered in the hallway, voices breaking with disbelief. Some wept, some argued with administrators, but the answer was the same. The room was reassigned, renovated, nothing more. Clara whispered, almost to herself, "They have erased the sanctuary." And Rowan? No one knew. He and Grace had not come that morning, nor the next after that. Ellison knocked at their small apartment. Empty. The landlord said they had left without a word. Rumors spread like wind. Some said Grace had taken Rowan away to protect him. Others said a wealthy patron had carried him off to train in secret. Darker voices whispered of institutions that silence those who threaten their order. But no one truly knew. The boy who had frozen Harvard, who had sat in silence at Zurich, was gone. In the weeks that followed, the absence itself became a presence. Students still gathered at dawn, sitting in the hallway outside the painted room. They brought notebooks, but left them unopened. They sat in silence, as though waiting for the sound of small footsteps. Ellison walked those halls with heavy heart. He saw the white walls and felt a grief deeper than he could name. On his office board, he pinned a single sheet of paper, Rowan's spiral drawn in faint pencil. He did not erase it. He could not. The world moved on. Other headlines rose. Other debates filled journals. The Loop Boy faded from the news. Some dismissed the entire story as myth, an invention of a tired professor. Others swore they had seen him in towns far away, teaching children in secret, leaving spirals on windows at dawn. But within Harvard, the memory lingered. Clara, years later, would say, "He vanished like a breath, but the silence he left behind stayed inside us." Grace, wherever she had gone, kept her promise to shield her son. Perhaps she chose a forgotten town, far from eyes that burned too bright. Perhaps she found a place where loops could rest. And Rowan, did he feel the loss of room 214? Did he remember the faces that once listened in silence? Or did he, in his gentle way, let the loop forget, so the next one could remain? Years passed. Harvard's walls grew older, its portraits gathered more dust. Students came and went, professors retired, journals filled with new symbols, new questions. Yet in quiet corners, one memory lingered. The boy who had once frozen Harvard with a question. Rowan Wells had disappeared. To some, he was myth. To others, only rumor. His name fell from the headlines, his face blurred with time. The world had moved on. But not all loops vanish. Some bend quietly, circling back when no one expects. It was in a forgotten town, far from Boston, where winters were long and the soil poor. Few trains stopped there. Fields stretched empty, and houses leaned with age. Yet in the middle of town stood a small red-brick library, long abandoned. Its windows were cracked, its shelves bare. Children passed it on their way to school but never entered. One November morning, as the first snow began to fall, the door of that library opened. Inside, a broom swept dust from the floor. A man moved slowly, his shoulders narrow, his hair touched with early gray, though his face was still young. In his pocket was a piece of chalk. It was Rowan Wells. He had returned not to Harvard, not to Zurich, not to any hall of fame, but to a town where children had no place to read, no teacher to listen. With his mother beside him, older now but her eyes still steady, Rowan unlocked the forgotten library. Together they cleaned the broken chairs, mended shelves, lit the old stove. When the children of the town peeked in, Rowan smiled shyly. "Would you like to sit?" he asked. They entered, hesitant at first, then gathering around wooden tables. Rowan picked up the chalk and drew a spiral on the blackboard that had not been used in years. "This," he said softly, "is how a loop remembers. And this," he added, drawing another curve, "is how it forgets. Both are needed." The children leaned closer, eyes wide. They did not know Harvard. They did not know Zurich. But they knew the warmth of someone who spoke gently, who listened to their questions as though each were precious. Word spread through the small town. Farmers, shopkeepers, mothers, fathers, curious, they came to the library on cold evenings. Rowan spoke not as a scholar, but as a neighbor. He showed them that mathematics was not distant but close, woven into the patterns of seeds, rivers, and breath. He never claimed to be genius. He never spoke of Harvard. He only said, "Every loop needs a home. This library is ours." The years deepened. Winters came and went. Each autumn, when the first snow fell, the townspeople would gather in the library. Rowan would draw a spiral on the window glass, fogged by breath, and the children would whisper, "The loop has come home." Grace watched her son with quiet pride. She had carried him through shadows, through storms of praise and scorn. Now she saw him not swallowed by the world, but giving back to it, gently, humbly, like a lamp burning steady in a dark room. Ellison never saw him again. Yet in his old age, He sometimes received envelopes without return address. Inside each was a sheet of paper with a simple spiral, drawn in chalk dust rubbed onto the page. No words, only the spiral. He pinned them to his wall, smiling through tears. In the town, Rowan never spoke of his past. To the children, he was simply their teacher. To the elders, he was the man who reopened the library. Only when asked about loops did he pause, eyes distant, and say, "Some questions are not solved. They are carried, and carrying them is enough." On a winter evening, as fire crackled in the stove, Rowan looked out at the snow falling through the library windows. He whispered to the children, "One day, you will go beyond this town. You will study, you will wander. And when you do, remember this. Knowledge is not only about solving, it is also about listening. About letting silence speak." The children nodded, though they did not yet understand. But years later, when they grew, when they faced their own questions, they remembered. Thank you, my friends, for staying with Rowan's story until the very last snowfall. If you have listened this far, it means the question has also touched your heart. Rowan's journey reminds us that genius can be found in the most fragile places, and that sometimes the smallest voice carries the farthest. If this story has warmed you, if it has brought back the quiet faith that knowledge and kindness still belong together, I invite you to stay close. Subscribe so that more stories of hidden brilliance, of healing, and of home can find their way to you. From my heart to yours, thank you for listening. Until the next story, may every loop in your life find its way home.